Hello and welcome to the Higher Learning Exchange podcast, a space for innovators to push the boundaries of education, practice, and technology. Hello and welcome. I am Carmen Tomas, your host today, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Teresa Rose. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Carmen. Delighted to be here.
Teresa Rose is an award-winning learning and performance consultant and the founder of Consult Her Limited. She's got more than 15 years of experience in organizational and people development, and you've dealt with areas going from program design all the way to doing digital learning technologies for organizations. So, Teresa, with your very broad client portfolio, you work with large organizations, international, global organizations. Can you give us some insight into what are the skills that are in most demand from your perspective and all this experience?
This is an interesting one because I tend to find that skills in the communication area are always the ones that are at the top of organisational lists, top of managers' lists, that we need to develop people to communicate better, even though we're working with a lot of technology and a lot of technical skills and very specific skills are needed. Those we might call soft skills or behavioural skills are vitally important because they enable people to get their work done. So even though we have all this technology at our disposal and people focus maybe on technical skills, it's always those behavioural skills that the underpinning foundation that are needed and they're always in demand.
So even if there's a lot of technology, still communication is at the forefront, and we still need to pay attention to that.
Yes. Okay. Yes, definitely.
Any other skills?
Well, we can't not talk about artificial intelligence. So it would probably be that in terms of thinking more about the application and use of artificial intelligence. So we're moving from digital literacy to AI literacy. Mm-hmm. So thinking around how you can use that technology to make your work and your processes better, but keeping to guardrails. And that's where another more behavioural skill starts to come in, like critical thinking. Okay. So not taking things at face value that you feel like the AI is delivering, and thinking around the shortcuts that as humans our brains will use, like heuristics, that there is that caveat around the use of artificial intelligence that we really need to be critical in what we evaluate and the content that it provides us.
So, Teresa, you talk a lot about the skills-based organization. So can you share a little bit about the background to this, where this comes from, and why is it so important right now?
I was quite shocked when I started to research because it's been a prevalent trend in the last maybe 3 years and has grown as a result of research from Deloitte and a paper called, I wouldn't call it a paper, it's more a report on skills-based organisations. And that phrase has become kind of a marketing phrase. But when I started to do my research, because I'm very much about evidence-based and where do these things originate and come from, and I found research in the early 90s by Lawler et al. And they called it skills-based. They called it skills-based human resource management. And they looked at practices in organisations where work was deconstructed into skills and tasks. And it was prevalent in more fluid labour markets, particularly in consultancies, in IT. And it's something that now organisations are wanting to take that methodology and are using technology to scale it as well. So they're using artificial intelligence to both infer skills, upskilling and reskilling opportunities, and recommend people for roles and much more. So that's why it's become important, because there's lots of data on the skills and capabilities that people have.
And where is that data coming from exactly?
That data is coming from a combination of sources. So it's coming from data inside the organisation, from people data. Some technology can scrape other platforms as well, scrape the data from things like Teams and Slack, where people are carrying out their work. So it shows their competency in the skills or their capability in the skills. It will use market data, external data. So there are sources like Lightcast, which is open API, so that can be used. And they are also using human oversight as well. So if you're looking at a good quality data, it's using that combination, but also with human oversight and not relying on the artificial intelligence.
Okay, and what's the sort of input of humans in this in that process?
Where you've got good oversight, it might be the use of industrial organisational psychologists to look at any skills content for bias. You're also looking internally with your subject matter experts and your stakeholders to make sure that skills information is context driven and relevant. So there are different points, and something that's not often talked about around skills-based organisations, if that's what we want to call them, is around the governance aspect as well. That's really important, how and where you're using that skills data and information to make decisions on people and on their roles.
And so do you, when you're working with organisations, you also work you work from this data, but you're also having humans and people interpret what's coming out and making decisions for what ultimately you need, you want, and validating this. Is that kind of the work?
Yeah, validation is the word. That is really important to have, but you can't have that if you've got a huge organisation. You've got to think really strategically. Another overused word. You've got to think around where is the most important area of your skills engine inside your organisation, where it does need that human oversight. Where can you be more subjective, and where do you need to be more objective with your data and your decisions, and being transparent about that as well.
Are you able to share some case where this worked, where they've got a skills-based organisation?
Yeah, not an organisation I've worked in myself, because I've been doing a lot of research around this. And as I say, it's relatively new. So the evidence and information that's out there isn't that rigorous yet, because it takes time to do this work. However, some organisations, like Unilever, they're a case study that are out in the open. So you could go and read about this. They've saved a lot of hours and time on moving people around, breaking down their work into tasks. Now, they're a fast-moving consumer goods business, and it fits for their organisation. So I think the caveat I would have around any of this is, yes, there are really great case studies out there. Some of them are part marketing hype as well. So please dig underneath the bonnet on these case studies, which is what I tend to do. But is it right for your organisation? It might only be right for parts of your organisation. And I've been talking around skills portfolio management and segmentation of skills in your organisation, and it might not be something that works across a very complicated company. It might be parts of it, like, say, for example, information technology, where reskilling and upskilling is really pivotal. There's so much change there. Or where you really need that data and insights, or it might be a particular process in your organisation where applying a skills-based approach saves you time, saves you money. So it's really looking at what are the business imperatives and how are you making working lives easier, reducing friction for employees. So you're looking at what's in it for all aspects of your organisation, your broader organisation, your managers, your talent acquisition teams, and ultimately your employees.
So how does this, with all these powerful techniques and technologies and methodologies you're describing, how does this look like to the employee? You know, what experience are they getting? Are they getting the benefit of all this data as well? And in what ways?
Well, if you're doing this in the right way, the employee will have ownership of their data and their skills. Often the question's asked, who owns skills? And I always say it's the employee. And that's always been the way, because it's a transaction. The employee brings their skills to the organisation, their knowledge and expertise, and they turn that into output in some way or knowledge. So with the data that's in a lot of the technology platforms, there are controls similar to LinkedIn where an employee can choose what visibility their profile and their data has. And it's also how much love they put into their profile and how proactive they are in taking opportunities and developing their own skills once they've got these data and insights. So they can take skills assessments, they could perhaps ask for peer feedback, people that know the type of work that they do, and look at themselves holistically, and it's about how marketable they are. There's been a lot of talk about skills being the new currency of work, and skills-based pay is starting to be talked about and discussed. And again, that's something that I found in my research originates from the 90s. It was being used in the 90s, probably not that prevalent, but there's a lot of discussion around people being paid for skills now. So skills will have a value attached to them about how important they are, maybe nationally, internationally, but also inside the organisation.
I love the person. So the person is central here. So would they get, for example, their own dashboard with their skills profiles? And you've talked about that they could actually go and seek feedback. Can you talk a little bit more about these elements and how you see them as well? And how are they being used? Because, for example, all these peer feedback, self-assessments, this is an area where the mainstream education sector, they're still kind of finding a way to adopt and adapt these other, more different kinds of assessment techniques. So can you talk a little bit more about that and the role that this plays with the combination of these tools that now present you data about your skills? How does this work?
Your question is making me think firstly around culture. So I've worked in a lot of organisations where there isn't a feedback culture. So that presents a challenge. So you might bring in this technology, but if culturally, and this is where my organisational development hat starts to come on, and I use the phrase, which is a bridge from Drucker, that culture eats tech for breakfast. He said culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's similar. So you've really got to think around not adding too much burden for managers and employees, and that goes back to what I said before about removing and reducing friction for them. And what's the benefits for me to gather this feedback, and do people give me the feedback? So if the feedback culture is not there, you've got to start to build that into your processes and your ways of working. So it might be that you've got a very individualized reward basis, so that reduces working in teams. But then if you have teamwork as a key skill in your organization, but you're not putting any other drivers in to enable people to want to deliver teamwork because you're rewarding them individually and you're not giving a team reward element, then they're not going to be skilled in teamwork because your mechanisms inside your incentives are driving them to think of their work on an individual basis. So there's a lot to think about and unpick around that, and also the time that people might think, I don't want to take ages looking at assessments. And the word assessment can be a scary word as well, a bit like performance management and performance reviews.
So can we onto the, quite nicely, we were going to talk about assessments. So what can you tell us about the assessment of skills? And then in this sort of, in the skills-based organization, how, what methods are you encouraging organizations to adopt?
Okay, so you have self-assessment, which is, we know that's subjective. And I've mentioned as well about platforms that might pull data from other sources from the work that people are doing. You might have manager feedback and assessments. It's the questions, I suppose, that are asked, but the more data you gather, the more objective the decisions could be taken. So if you get lots of peer feedback, the systems can then aggregate that data, and they won't start to aggregate your data until you've got a number of pieces of feedback that might not be just quantitative, but will also be qualitative as well. So it's statements, things that help. So normally you're going to have to get that stakeholder information feedback for mid-year reviews, end-of-year reviews, or depending on what your performance process is. So it's starting, as I mentioned before, to look at the processes that you have, unpicking those processes, reimagining them, those processes, using tools like Service Blueprint, pulling on things from service design or design thinking to redesign the way that you work if you're starting to work in a skills-based way.
I'm more thinking about the assessment of students and how can we assess them in a way that it's more aligned with how we're assessing in the real world. The other task that we have in universities is to also assess them in authentic ways. So it's really interesting to hear that in skills-based organizations and what advanced organizations are doing, they're actually looking for samples of work across the piece, but then feedback from different groups. And that is really a really good example to aspire to for universities when we think about how we assess students.
Yeah, and I'm also starting to see, we've touched a little bit on artificial intelligence, where there are tools now that can assess on more behavioural skills. And I'm really excited by some of those. So it might be, I'm going to do a presentation, and it might look at areas where you may be using filler words, you're speaking too fast, you're not clear, the audience might understand. And the research that one organisation I've been chatting to, and I'll give them a shout out, they're called Bongo, they have found that employees are more likely to prefer the artificial intelligence's feedback than their managers, and they trust it more. So they feel they're in a safer space by getting that feedback through the AI as opposed to a manager or someone that they work with.
And particularly you're touching on a point which is assessing presentations, which is always one of the most subjective ones, right? So you're saying that you've got AI tools that are assisting organizations to provide feedback in that particular area. Okay, and particularly talking about communication, which is something you mentioned. Could you give us other examples that you're seeing?
There are, I think I may have touched on it earlier, but there are tools out there that are now starting to scrape the data in what's been called like workflow, within the workflow. So it's looking at, because we're using things like Teams now and we're using Slack a lot, that they can look at how do you maybe support and engage with the rest of your team. How are you an expert? So if you're doing a skills assessment, and there's normally a rubric which you would call in the university, but we call them proficiency levels in organisations, and a lot of people will go and they'll self-rate and they'll say, I'm an expert and I'm really knowledgeable in this. But have you got the evidence to demonstrate that you are an expert? So some of the processes that we're putting in is, well, they will have to have a peer review. So if they rate themselves as expert in order to go into, say, promotion or a mobility process to be moved around, in terms of talent, then we need more data. And so it's a requirement that you will have to have robust peer data, or maybe go through another assessment, like say maybe something like Bongo, where you have to prepare and do a presentation. There are lots of other use cases for something like that as well beyond presentation skills. It might be that you're doing a one-to-one with a manager, or you're a manager that's doing, say, something like a return to work interview, and how you showing empathy, or how are you going through a process correctly? So you start to build that into some of your assessment tools, because you think about some of the work that I've done in the past where I might do whole day assessments for high value hires. That's still it's still people that are assessing, where the AI can, as you said, be more objective rather than subjective but you can never be perfect. That's the other thing. I think it's really important to bear in mind that nothing will ever be 100% perfect, but there are now tools that can make that data more robust than it's been before.
So, Teresa, thank you so much. We're going to know the last question. So you've told me your kids are in university now. So you have a sense of where the sector is at, but you're also seeing, all these advanced developments, skills-based organization, how this is, developing and evolving. So if you could change, for example, how your son is learning in university, what would your advice be, and what opportunities do you think we're missing in terms of preparing students better for the world of work, seeing that you're so experienced and you're kind of at the heart of the skills work in organizations?
A few areas on that. There probably isn't enough link up to industry and organisations with universities. There seems to be a lot of talk about it. So when you go to induction days, they talk about how they've got all these link ups with firms, but I don't see that in action. And he's studying cybersecurity. It's a high demand area. And I think as well, some of the lecturers that he's had are probably not up to speed as much as he is, because they maybe haven't got that industry knowledge. So there's maybe the need for topics like that, subject areas like that are so critical, that you're bringing in people from organisations into the university to support the faculty, or the faculty spends time out more within the inside organisations to understand the reality and the context of what it's like to work, because you can do your research papers and you might be doing them around some practical application, but until you start to get into that, into the reality of it, then you're not really setting people up for work. And one of the areas I see in organisations too, and it filters through from, I think, from secondary education to university, and then how we work and learn, and the importance of learning all the time and developing yourself all the time, because skills are becoming obsolete at a much faster rate, is the ability to know how to learn, meta learning. How do I learn? What are the best methods for me to learn? What do I choose to learn? And how do I go about it? It's what are the methods, the brain aspects, the neuroscience aspects, which you don't hear talked about in schools. There are some great people that are working in organisations that I know. So there's Lauren Wildman that I would say look at her work, and Stella Collins, who are both got neuroscience backgrounds, and they're trying to do a lot of work in organisations to look at brain-friendly learning, and for organisations to understand actually people need time to space. Because if you're looking at reskilling and upskilling programmes, what space and time are you going to give people to put that into practice? How are you going to provide scaffolding? Because typically the last few years, with the advent of technology to scale up learning and development, self-directed learning has been the aspiration, but it's not delivered. So learning and development departments in organisations are not delivering return on investment. They're not improving people's performance and their abilities, etc. They're kind of leaving them to it. Here's a load of content. We might still concentrate on leadership and management programs where people come in and we're doing coaching with them, but the vast majority of your employees, they're just really left to it.
Okay, and basically, is how can we empower each of these individuals to learn how to learn, to be in control, and this is great food for thought for mainstream education. Fantastic. Well, plenty information you've shared today, and thanks for sharing so generously all your experience. Thanks, Teresa. I think we'll probably have you back, to talk about how those success cases in driving skills-based organizations and this empowerment of learners in the workplace.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it and hope the listeners do too.